All right, let's go ahead and get started here. Welcome to the Cisco Theater. We're glad to have you guys here. You know, in this session, we call this a fireside chat, and you're going to learn about Dayton Children's Hospital's zero trust journey, the challenges, how the technology partnership accelerates their security strategy, and where to begin with asset discovery and micro-segmentation. And here to tell us all about it are J.D. Whitlock and Jim Hyman. JD is the CIO of Dayton Children's Hospital, and Jim is the CEO of Ordr. So please join me in giving a rock star welcome for JD Whitlock and Jim Hyman. Let's hear it for them.
First, I want to say thank you to Cisco for having us and letting us present. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to meet JD. JD Whitlock is the CIO at Dayton Children's Hospital. He's been there for more than 5 years, but he has more than 25 years of experience in the healthcare industry overall. And it's a great opportunity for him to give us an idea of what he's seeing with respect to a journey towards zero trust. My name is Jim Hyman. I'm the CEO at Ordr. We are a company that is in the business of protecting connected devices and have done a lot of work with JD and his team. And so it's really a pleasure to be here. And thanks everyone for coming.
So I'd love just to start off with a little bit of history of Dayton's Children's and kind of a little bit about it and kind of what we're going to be talking about.
Dayton Children's is a small children's hospital in Southwest Ohio. With some stats as you see behind us, we are not a small organization in terms of, there's a lot of organizations smaller that have a lot of cybersecurity responsibilities. However, in health systems terms, we are small. We're on the small end of Epic customers, and we have all the same cybersecurity responsibilities as larger health systems, and that is sometimes challenging to do with smaller teams and smaller budgets, and that is part of what we're going to be talking about today.
Great. So I'd love just to start, part of this conversation is zero trust, the other part is cybersecurity, which they're overlapped, but I'd love just to talk a little bit about the cybersecurity strategies, kind of what's at the top of your list, and kind of just a strategic view, starting with kind of just cyber as a baseline.
Sure. So obviously cyber is critical to everyone, and the game is always how do you do the best job you can with limited resources that you have available. And that goes both into personnel resources and cybersecurity suite resources. Of course, we are all terrified of every time we pick up the paper, look at the trade email about some other health system being ransomwared. And that is a not quite an existential threat, but a really, really, really bad situation that, of course, we want to avoid at all costs. And so we'll dive into that. That's really where the zero trust stuff comes in. Other, of course, we're all getting phished all the time, every day. And recently we're starting to see some more sophisticated man-in-the-middle attacks to get past the MFA. I don't know if others, I see some security titles on some people here. Are other people seeing that too? Man-in-the-middle attacks, so they can get past your MFA. And so those are probably the two biggest things that we want to avoid. And so we'll talk a little more about how we do that.
So one of the things that, from an Ordr perspective, for those not familiar with Ordr, we are a company that's in the business of protecting connected devices. We do a lot of business in the healthcare space with many, many hospitals. And one of the things that our philosophy is really threefold, which is first you have to see what's on your network in order to be able to do anything about it. The second thing is you have to know what it is. So knowing that it's there is one thing, knowing how it's supposed to act, who it's supposed to call out to, who it's supposed to be communicating with, kind of knowing what it's supposed to be doing is that second phase. The third phase is kind of a security phase, and that is you see it doing something it's not supposed to be doing. There's a ransomware attack in process. It's calling out to an IP address in a country that it should not be calling out to. How do you take advantage of that? How do you automatically take action? So that's an Ordr view of the world. One of the problems in the healthcare industry is that you can't just shut down a device. So for those of you in the IT business who say, hey, if something's acting up, I'm just going to take it offline. You can't do that with a pump. You can't do that with an MRI machine. You can't do that with a heart monitor. So it poses a very different type of problem that we need to solve with respect to zero trust. So I'd love to get your thoughts from Dayton's perspective. Medical devices are just different
Right.
from a cybersecurity perspective in terms of how you treat them. The second part of that question is the proliferation of these devices. I mean, the number of devices in a hospital today are exponentially growing, almost quarter over quarter. So I'd love to get a sense for like how is that different, and how are you handling that?
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, in the note about you can't just shut things down, we had previously used a vendor. I won't mention their name. They're a perfectly good vendor, and I think it probably is a very good solution outside of healthcare, leveraging AI to detect anomalies and then shutting things down proactively. Well, you can't do that in healthcare, right? So what we found was the features that made that platform unique were things that we really couldn't use. We ultimately switched to the Cisco cybersecurity suite that we're pretty happy with. And that in combination with Ordr gives us the complete visibility that we really need. So we've got on our network, we've got around 5,000 PCs that we can put agents on with our Cisco suite. There's another 20,000 um, uh, Internet of Things and Internet of Medical Things that we cannot put agents on, and that is why the tool set that we have from Ordr is so important to be listening to the traffic and identifying where we have issues and just the visibility of these medical devices because Ordr has such a nice catalog. It can look at the traffic, look what's going over the wire, and say, okay, these devices are here, these devices are here. And I'm going to tell a story about a close call we had a couple years ago, where this tool set was very useful. Another health system, which shall remain nameless, that we shared images with across a VPN, got hacked. They started scanning across this VPN. Now, one of the lessons learned was that VPN, we didn't have that VPN configured appropriately. It shouldn't have been as open as it was. Bad on us. But it's got some scanning coming across there. We pretty quickly figured out what was going on, shut that off. We told the other organization that they got hacked. Okay. However, not before some our imaging devices, as most of you all know that are in this business, running on some old embedded Win 7 and other old operating systems, they got dropper files. Okay. Dropper files, for those of you that may not know this, that's not the malware, that's the advanced team that's going to try to download the malware. You still don't want it. It's still dangerous. It's not technically the malware. Now, our Cisco suite prevented any malware from actually getting on those devices. Nevertheless, we didn't know that at the time. We had to shut that down really quickly. Leveraging the Ordr tool set, the team could very quickly say, these are the devices, this is what they look like, this is where they are, go unplug those now. And it's that visibility that we got with this Ordr tool set that prevented that situation from being any worse than it was. We're able to reimage those, just a handful of devices very quickly, and that was mostly a non-event, even though it was kind of scary, obviously.
Yeah, I can imagine. So two follow-on questions, and then I want to walk through kind of the architectural diagram of what you're doing with Cisco and what you're doing with Ordr. I think it would be interesting to look at it from an architecture perspective. But before that, two follow-ons. I hear a lot about the fact that there are devices running old operating systems, Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows, whatever, that are no longer supported. And primarily it's because they are devices that work today. So you don't want to necessarily get rid of them, and you don't have the money or the budget to go replace everything when it's working properly, but they can't be patched. They can't be upgraded. So can you just talk a little bit about kind of how that works in your mind when you think about devices on your network they're just cost prohibitive to go replace, and they're working, but they're out of patch or out of date in terms of support?
Right, and out of that story, of course, a big part of that story is the FDA certification of these devices. Mm-hmm. So it's not just that we can't get around to patching them, it's that we literally can't because of the FDA certification. Okay, now the good news is the government is finally doing something about this. And recently, there's been some new legislation or regulation where the FDA is going to mandate for the device manufacturers that they're going to have a software bill of materials, and they're going to be able to address some of this problem on the front end, where traditionally there hasn't been very much of that. However, that'll be many years before that's going to be of any practical benefit. So
Yep.
we're still, most of us are still stuck with this situation. Right, you're not going to replace that $2 million MRI. I don't know how much. What do MRI machines cost these days? A couple million. You're not going to rip and replace that because it's an old operating system, right?
Yeah,
So we
interesting.
have to deal with these cyber vulnerabilities and manage it as well as we can, given these cyber tools.
Yeah, it's interesting. So that's the part B of my question. Then you have devices that you can't upgrade or patch for a variety of reasons, which is so different than the IT world, right? I mean, we've all been in the IT world where you get a note from someone that says, if you don't upgrade your phone in the next 20 minutes, we're going to take off, we're going to take you off our network. So what is your thought today? I look at it and I think the idea of IOMT, right? IOMT, IoT, and IT in my mind are all just blurring, because at the end of the day, they all need to be protected, not as a separate thing, but as a standard policy.
Right.
Is that how you view it from a Dayton's perspective, that it's all under a security umbrella, that one way or the other needs to be handled, or is it a separate beast?
Well, I'd say both, and they're all part of they're all threats to the network, and so we're addressing them with a lot of the same tools. However, it is useful to make a distinction whether the M is there in the IoT or not, because we have a lot of other devices that are not medical, that are not FDA, right? But cameras and TVs and all sorts of other things out there, they may not be quite as big a threat because they're probably not running that old, not supported operating system. But they could be threats in other ways, like supply chain attacks. If the vendor gets hacked and they're in there, you need to be doing other things, privileged access management, and other good cyber practices to be dealing with that. So yes, they're the same. There are in our security perimeter. We wanted to implement zero trust policies that apply to everything, but no, they're not, and that we approach them a little bit differently.
Great, great. So I'd love to transition, if I can, and just have you talk a little bit about Cisco and Ordr and kind of what your architecture looks like, kind of touch on whatever you think is relevant in terms of this journey. Again, this conversation is an interesting one to me because all of this is kind of on a path to what we refer to as zero trust. I bet if I asked everybody in this audience what zero trust meant, I'd get 20 different answers. And so really this is kind of practical experience from your real world of kind of how you're using these tools and how it's played into kind of what you're doing today.
Right. So I mentioned we're a Cisco shop for networking and data center and cyber suite. I am a big believer in the same way many of us are on Epic, and we kind of like that. And we're not going to chase after the bright shiny object. We're going to use the next thing coming down the road with our platform vendors already. A little bit of similar situation here with the Cisco suite. And so because Ordr and Cisco have a nice partnership, we can put the Ordr listeners directly onto a certain class of the Cisco network devices. That's sort of the higher end Epic or higher end Cisco devices, which is very helpful. And then what we can do is Ordr can look at where these medical devices are talking to each other. So if that MRI machine only ever talks to these 5 other IPs, and we can say that it hasn't talked to anything else in 2 months, guess what? Probably doesn't need to talk to anything else, right? So Ordr can generate the access control list code that can go into Cisco's ICE that can actually implement these policies. Now, I'm not claiming that we've completely done this, and we're really in the earlier stages of the zero trust journey. But the point is, this combination of this tool set, it makes that even feasible for our relatively small team.
Yeah, one of the things that we've seen with our Cisco integrations with customers is that the data set that we're able to feed, the attributes that we're able to feed into something like ICE,
makes it a much more flexible tool overall. Is that what you're starting to see, or is that kind of the hope when this goes through?
That is exactly the hope. Yes,
Okay.
right. And so the way different sort of different philosophies of um, another main cyber platform vendor out there, which is a little bit more focused on the flexibility on the firewall side, and whereas Cisco is more focused on the defense in depth and the zero trust side with the policies that you can put into ICE, wherever ICE is on here. ICE is someplace up there.
So somewhere on the screen. Okay. So one of the use cases that I hear a lot about is devices before that were unable to have, unable to manage devices without a client. They get put into a bypass list that just says, hey, they're different. And now customers are looking at us saying, I don't want a bypass list that just grows and grows and grows and becomes this abyss where somebody just lives on it. So is your goal at the end of this journey to have everything to have an attribute that you then have the ability to control and see what it's doing and how it's doing and be able to take action? Like that's the end game of kind of the zero trust in your mind?
That would be the goal, yes.
Okay.
I'm not claiming or anywhere.
No, I understand. It's a journey, no doubt about it. So if I'm a CIO and I don't have a zero trust plan yet, and I don't have, maybe I don't even have support from my board or from whoever it may be from a budget perspective or an overall perspective, what advice? Like, how do I get started on this journey if I decide that this is something I need to be doing? We need to protect the organization, but I'm not even sure. This just seems like a 2,000-pound gorilla that I don't know how to tackle. Where do you start? Where did you start? And kind of what's the advice to the new CIO who's embarking on this?
So first of all, you hopefully have a relationship with the board. We have I think, appropriate relationship with the board in that hopefully you have some IT expertise on your board. We have one local IT entrepreneur that's on our board, and she's the CEO of IT services company. And so what we'll sometimes do is we'll do one version of what we're presenting and asking for to the regular board, and we have a more detailed version that we go present to her ahead of time. And then when we're talking, her head is hopefully going north and south, and the other board members see that. So hopefully you have some kind of a dynamic that's going on. A couple years ago, the SolarWinds hack that many of us were affected by, and if you don't know what that is, that was some software that lots of organizations, I think like 18,000 organizations were compromised by malware that was in an update to SolarWinds. And but the bad guys only had so much bandwidth to exploit the back doors that they had, and they were going after large government agencies. And so the joke was, well, we got compromised by this along with 18,000 other companies, but we weren't in little old Dayton Children's Hospital wasn't important enough for the bad guys to actually exploit. Try explaining that to your board, right? So anyways, we explained that to the IT expert on the board. So hopefully you have some kind of a dynamic there. Now, even if your board are not a bunch of cyber experts, they can read the paper and they understand at a high level what ransomware is, and of course they don't want your health system to be in the news like that. And so what my strategy has just been, every year, yes, we are asking for a little bit more. Sometimes in a bad financial year, we're still asking for the right thing from a cybersecurity perspective, but not like crazy levels of new things all at once, because that's probably not going to fly. So those are conversations that I have with my boss, our CFO. What's the next logical thing? I don't want to talk too much about the next thing we're doing. For some reasons, you don't want to talk about publicly about everything you're doing in cyber, but we are advancing that every year, little bit by little. When I arrived 5 years ago, it was not a good situation. There was not a good cyber plan, and now we're in a much better place.
And I think it's an obvious statement, but we've talked about it offline as well a little bit, that the idea of getting to zero trust is a journey. It's not really a destination. Like, it's not all of a sudden you wake up one day and say, okay, we're done. The second thing we've talked a lot about is that every journey starts with a single step. I'm butchering that phrase a little bit, but essentially you don't have to do it all at once. And it seems like you've gone along that path of picking out the bite-sized chunks each year that you're asking for and that you're implementing. So that leads me to my next question then. You brought it up. and that is we're in a world today where budgets are not free, right? Everybody I talk to is getting clamped down. They say cut 10%, cut this, cut that. So how do you balance it? You've got cybersecurity, which I'm assuming you have an endless list that you could ask for if you wanted to, but now you're probably even under more pressure. So can you just how do you position the budget? How do you think about that from a cyber perspective? And then B, where does cyber fit compared to everything else you're doing as a CIO?
Sure. So one thing worth mentioning, of course, a lot of organizations now are putting their CISO outside of IT, reporting up through the compliance, and there are religious wars about what the right way of doing that is. I think it belongs, I guess I'm biased, I'm a CIO. I think it belongs under CIO because the really hard bits in making tough choices about what gets done and doesn't do, you really need to have the network team joined at the hip with your cyber team. If you don't have that, it's just a bunch of shots across the bow going both ways. So I think it really ought to be integrated like that. But there are certainly many organizations that don't have that, and that's an important part of that. Is what are your organizational dynamics for that? In terms of how you deal with this in a extremely resource constrained environment, we are um, we are blessed to be, although everybody is dealing with, labor costs going up 10% and reimbursement going up 2%, and the math doesn't work out very well there. We're blessed to have been in a good overall financially good place where it's not an existential threat. Like I know some health systems are dealing with existential threats and that financial existential threats, and that I can't answer that for them. For us, it was what I said a minute ago. We're not asking for the world every year. We're asking for that next thing that is the next smart thing to do to increase the security of our network. And our leadership has been very supportive of that.
Has the position of cyber changed in that conversation, both from kind of pre-pandemic to pandemic to post-pandemic? Is the importance of the cyber dollar changed in your world at all, or is it all still cyber and it's top of the list?
So certainly, the single biggest thing that happened cyber-wise was obviously supporting a lot of folks working from home on a whole other level. So at Dayton Children's, we had an administrative building like a lot of health systems do. The real estate on your main campus is so valuable, you go rent an office building someplace, right? Well, by definition, if you worked in that office building when the pandemic hit, you just went to work from home. But what did that mean? All of a sudden, that meant our attack surface just got a lot bigger, right? That's where we started using the Cisco umbrella tool that we had actually not had before. So we actually expanded some of the Cisco tools to be better able to handle that. And the majority of the people in that building never came back to work. My team, except for the field support folks that show up and fix your computer, never came back to work. And our CEO called our bluff, and she turned our office floor into an event space. So now I don't have an office. Yeah.
You go away long enough, they give away your space.
Exactly.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
Hey, last question, and then I know there are a bunch of folks that are standing. For those of you who weren't here in the beginning, JD's background is really 25 years in healthcare, Dayton's Children, CIO, kind of going along this zero trust. So I have one last question, and if there are questions that people want to ask, this is a great opportunity. You have JD captive here as long as he's willing to sit in the chair. And then I will do a little bit of a shameless plug for Cisco. After there is a happy hour from 4 to 5:30. I'm probably getting the times wrong, but call it 3:45 to 5:30. So join me, you can ask questions there as well. But last question for this, there's a lot going on, and I don't know how much you hinted at it, not all of it's public, but can you share anything about kind of what the future holds here? Like, are there major initiatives that you think are coming up in the next year or two for you that are big beasts that are hard to tackle, or just things that you think are top of the list?
Sure. So as the whole world is talking everything AI, and most of the conversations, of course, are how do we leverage large language models to make life easier on our doctors and nurses. On the cyber side, of course, we're scared about the bad guys getting a hold of that, right? And increasing threats, whether it's smarter phishing, whether it's better able to do spear phishing en masse, right? Those are the kind of things like what are they going to how are the bad guys going to come up with next slightly tweaking the code so that some of our scanning software is not recognizing things. So who knows 6 months from now how the bad guys are going to leverage some of that. That's pretty scary. Um, Other things coming in the future. I'm happy to see that in the same way that the FDA has recently been given the authority to really clamp down on some of the medical device manufacturers. That the government, I know Senator Warner in Virginia has put together a lot of a plan. I don't know where this is exactly in the legislative flow, but the government is realizing we really have to do better to support our critical infrastructure. An interesting thing is that our law enforcement agencies can ultimately track down the bad guys. They just don't have the resources to track down all the bad guys because there's so many of them. But when, at whatever point the bad guys get into, I know this has already happened a little bit, get into actually injuring patients, related to this, and we like focus, some more public punishment, perhaps, of some of the bad guys. Be interesting to see the government take a harder stand there. Oh, another piece of advice: we have a regional Southwest Ohio, Northern Kentucky. We have a regional group of healthcare CISOs and CIOs that get around and just collaborate together. Make sure you're a part of something like that. That's a really good way of getting resources and comparing notes.
Yeah, that's great. You actually mentioned something. It's not part of this conversation, but I find it so interesting is this large language models that you talk about from a threat perspective. I had a conversation with a CIO just last week talking about all the benefits you could get out of one of those models. And so it's very interesting to see how that progresses from a security perspective as well, to threaten you in other ways. All right, with that, JD, thank you very much.